Welcome to Contradicting the Cosmos, the show where I refute the YouTube atheist, the Cosmic Skeptic. Today's video will be a quick one rebutting the Cosmic Skeptic's argument against design. Let's begin.
Today I want to discuss something. I want to ask you the question, why is our universe so finely tuned?
So finely tuned for what? Of course, according to the biblical narrative, we humans, mankind, is made in the image of God, which would imply that the whole universe and everything in it is kind of made for our purposes. Now, I've personally always thought this to be quite an arrogant view, but it's pretty much universal across modern faith. But if you're claiming that the universe is finely tuned for humans, it's anything but. You'd probably have a stronger argument if you asked why the Earth is so finely tuned for humans, which it still isn't really. But on a cosmological scale, the vast majority of this universe is completely uninhabitable. We couldn't last 5 seconds pretty much anywhere other than Earth in the entire cosmos. And I pretty much fail to understand why an intelligent designer would design a universe which is pretty much built to kill us within seconds.
Well, how about for start he wants us to stay on the same planet. If the universe was not as inhospitable as it is, you may end up having a planet full of atheists. And that is a tragedy. The universe and everything in it is made for God's purposes, not ours. We are made for God. I feel like that's an important point that you should recognize, because you can say the universe is made for our benefit, but primarily everything is created by God for God. And the question you're failing to ask is, for what purpose? Given the size of the universe, 90% of it serves only the purpose of demonstrating God's power. There have, of course, been other uses for the universe, other benefits, that is. Sailors would navigate by the stars. That's pretty beneficial. And we would not have a stronger argument to say that Earth is finely tuned for humans, because it would still require a finely tuned universe. For instance, I think it's the gravitational constant. Too low, and the universe expands too quickly, and everything dies. Too high, and expansion stops, and just reverses, and everything dies. And that too high and too low are very minute changes to what it currently is. So yes, the universe is finely tuned for human life. And of course, the Earth is finely tuned for human life. Gravity's not so strong that it sucks all the blood down to our feet, and it's not so light that we just can't pump the blood at all, or whatever light gravity would do to our circulatory system. Not to mention ozone layer, perfect distance from the sun. There is a lot that goes into the finely tuned argument, which I couldn't possibly go into.
In the sand it says, John loves Mary. And you say, hey Joe, how did that get into the sand? And I say to you, oh yeah, it was the waves again. The waves did that. Are you gonna believe me? You're not, are you? Because you know that nature cannot create something so finely tuned in such a small area, can it?
Okay, so this is an argument that I'm sure that many of the people watching have heard before, although it does usually come in the form of a watch, like finding a pocket watch on a beach or in a forest, and instantly realizing that it must have been man-made. It can't have been created by nature because it's just too perfect. But the thing about a watch, and by extension the words John loves Mary written in the sand, is that they're clearly created in a top-down fashion. There's a designer who makes a design and then executes that design and actually physically makes it. In contrast, evolution, and I don't just mean biological evolution, I mean evolution of the stars and the planets in the universe, is bottom-up. It started off really simply, and then through a process of what could be described as cosmological trial and error, evolved into the universe that we see today. As an example, you may note that there are billions of planets in the universe, most of which are pretty much perfectly orbiting their stars at speeds which don't cause them to spiral in and eventually be destroyed by their stars. And it is tempting to ask, how are the laws of physics so perfect that these planets can happily orbit their stars? But if you think about it, if the laws of physics were different, then these planets would have just spiraled in and been destroyed by their stars. And instead we'd see slightly slower moving planets, which would have had too much speed to be orbiting their stars, and we'd be asking the same question about them. So I think a more fitting analogy, if you want to employ imagery of a beach, is to imagine that you were on a really stony beach with stones as far as the eye could see in either direction. Now imagine you happen to come across a stone which seems perfect for skimming. You pick it up and it's perfectly flat and perfectly circular, and you think to yourself, How can this stone exist so perfectly? It must have had some kind of intelligent design. And again, this is quite a tempting conclusion to come to, but think for a minute, look around you and you'll see that there are tons of stones on the floor, most of which are just boulder like normal stones, but some are quite similar to the skimming stone, just maybe not perfectly circular or a bit too fat. And so you'd probably think to yourself that just given the sheer amount of stones and the amount of variety among them, that the likelihood of finding at least one example of a perfect skimming stone is pretty much inevitable. And yes, of course, it's still pretty unlikely that you'd just happen to come across that stone, but if you hadn't have done, then, well, you wouldn't have thought to ask the question in the first place. So in the same respect, it might be difficult to imagine that our planet just happens to have the perfect conditions for life, but it has to, because if it didn't, then life wouldn't have formed here to ask the question in the first place. And I'm sure that if it didn't, then probably somewhere else in the universe, life would have, and probably has, formed that maybe grew intelligent enough to ask itself the same question. I don't see why we can't just accept that we're incredibly lucky individuals to be at the end of a long evolutionary chain which took place on a planet with conditions perfect for its existence.
And he begs the question big time, and tries to hide this fact by saying designed top down and designed bottom up. And he assumes the universe came about by trial and error, but that begs the question, how can trial and error produce a finely tuned universe? Without any intelligence to learn from the error, though God didn't have to learn, trial and error could not produce finely tuned anything, because there is nothing stopping it from making the same error billions and billions of times. And then he tries to set up a straw man with this perfectly smooth stone. But there is nothing unbelievable about stumbling on a perfectly smooth stone. It has nothing to do with the odds of me being in the right place at the right time to find the stone. It's about how the stone got there in the first place. And for a stone, there's no problem believing it could have just eroded that way. But John Loves Mary, written in the sand, is not something that's going to happen by chance, or by trial and error of the waves. It's not going to happen bottom up. And it's that level of intricacy that is found in the universe and in DNA. And finally, for this clip, he tried to use the anthropic principle, which, rather than explain what that is, I'll just show a clip of Jason Lyle debunking it, and you'll know what I'm talking about.
And here's some examples that you've probably heard before, but maybe you didn't know they were fallacies. Why is the universe ideally suited for life? Because otherwise we wouldn't be here to observe it. Duh, the anthropic principle, right? Well, that is true, isn't it? It is true that if the universe were not ideally suited for life, we wouldn't be here to observe it. But that really doesn't explain why it's ideally suited for life, and so it doesn't answer the question. It'd be kind of like if I were the sole survivor of a plane crash, and a reporter came in to me and said, Dr. Lyle, why did you survive that crash? I said, well, because if I didn't, I wouldn't be here to answer your question, right? That doesn't answer the question, does it? Why did I survive it? I don't know, but in any case, that's not an answer. Why is the universe ideally suited for life? Because God created it that way, because as a creator. And the fact that we wouldn't be here to observe it otherwise is irrelevant. It's true, but it's irrelevant. Why do living creatures have complex parts that function together so perfectly? Because if they didn't, they would have died off. It is true that if they didn't, they would have died off, but that doesn't explain why they have them in the first place, does it? You know, natural selection does not explain why we find animals that are suited to their environment. It only explains why we do not find animals that are not suited to their environment. Think about that, it's different. Why do we find animals that are suited to their environment? Because God created animals with certain abilities so that they would be well suited to their environment. Yeah, those that aren't die off, that's true. But this isn't an answer to the question. All fallacies of irrelevant thesis can be answered with this simple response. True perhaps, but irrelevant.
Would be the final nail in the coffin for the teleological argument. It would be the sheer inefficiency of this supposed intelligent design. If this universe was truly created by an intelligent designer with the purpose of sustaining human life, then that intelligent designer did an incredibly inefficient job. If there was an intelligent designer, then why is the unimaginably vast majority of this universe completely uninhabitable?
Because the universe was not designed to be habitable, except on Earth.
Why do men have nipples?
What's wrong with men having nipples? That is a terrible argument against intelligent design, to say that because you don't know why something was put there, it must not have been intelligently designed. For instance, on This Old House, they sometimes have a segment where they introduce unusual products that have a specific purpose, and one by one, each of them try to guess what that purpose could be until they're finally told at the end. But none of them make the stupid argument that you're trying to make, that because they don't know what it's for, it must not have been designed. It must have come about by accident.
Why can the human eye only perceive the smallest imaginable fraction of the electromagnetic spectrum that we call visible light? It just doesn't make any sense.
Why would you need to see more than the visual spectrum of light? If you could see X-rays and infrared and ultraviolet rays and gamma rays and any other rays, you would probably be making the argument, how come we can see so much? An intelligent designer would have limited the amount we can see. Your argument does not hold water.
That is, that it doesn't make any sense if you invoke the idea of an intelligent designer. However, if you look at it from an anthropic or scientific viewpoint, all these things can be relatively easily explained. And so to conclude, I'll just say that if you want to use this argument from design, this teleological argument, then be my guest. But do be advised that the design that you're referring to is a pretty shoddy one.
Shoddy by what blueprint? Designs have purpose. Claiming you don't know what that purpose is, therefore it must be a bad design, or not designed at all, is an appeal to ignorance. We don't know what the purpose of the design is, therefore it must not be designed. That is not how you tell whether something is or is not designed.